This movie opens with a woman tiptoeing through the hospital floor in Lyon in December 2006. She calls to the nurses nervously. She tells them that someone has trouble breathing. The male nurse asks if it is Mathilde, and she nods to him. He gets up to go check on her. The woman stands outside the hospital room door nervously as the doctor checks on Mathilde. The doctor comes out to tell her that he increased her morphine and oxygen so she's not suffering. She tells him she didn't mean to disturb him, and he asks her if her name is Shauna. She confirms it is she, and he tells her that Mathilde has told her so much about her, and introduces himself as her doctor and a friend of her son, George's, who attends with him. Shauna tells him that George's needed to rest, so she took over for him, feeling sad. The doctor notices this and places his hand on hers to comfort her. He tells her that since they are all sharing the same ate, him, Mathilde, and her, that it's going to be okay and they should enjoy it while they still can. He takes her to the coffee machine, but she wants soup. He tells her it's disgusting, but she says she's always enjoyed that. He tells her about how her brain has learned to associate it with comfort in such distressing times. The two sit alone in the dimly lit hospital quietly. When Shauna excuses herself to be with Mathilde, the doctor assures her that the nurse will page him if they are needed. Shauna gladly sits back down and begins to tell him of her fondness of Mathilde and how she is like a sister to her when he is called away. It's 15 years later. Pierre is frantically moving through with his wife trying to go somewhere fast, but he's lost his ID. His reliable wife asks him when he lost it and goes to go find it. Georges calls him asking where he is when his wife comes in with the ID he'd lost. He says his goodbye to his family and leaves. They arrive at their destination. They stand in a line waiting to get in, and Georges asks Pierre to stay with him. At first he disagrees, but then Georges manages to convince him. They arrive at a gorgeous out-town house covered in shrubbery. Appearing from the house is Shauna. Georges gives her a hug upon seeing her and asks how she is, and she shows him how she's renovating. Shauna sees Pierre, and he recognizes her, but she seems not to recognize him. She tells him that the doctor she met at the hospital looked a lot younger than he does now, even if it's been 15 years. She invites them inside. They enter the house and Georges indulges Shauna as reminisces about her grandfather. She offers them drinks when Georges spots a photograph of his mother and asks Shauna about the photo. He asks her if she grew up in this small house considering she is a great architect. She tells him that her father lost his job and moved to the slums when she was 4. She told him about how she would both enter their room and they try to settle in, with Georges reminiscing about his mother and how weird it can feel when he sees Shauna, because his mother would have been the same age if she hadn't passed away. Shauna watches from the window as Pierre plays with the dog outside. The scene of Pierre in the beautiful old yard makes Shauna smile. In the evening, the rain pours down heavily over the older-looking house. The three discuss in front of a lit fire. Georges passionately describes his thoughts on the end, specifically perishing without the people he loves. Making fun of him, Shauna then suggests a woman for him to marry, but he already holds contempt for the girl she mentions. Georges feels that his job doesn't give him the threshold for daring anymore. Georges gets up and asks Pierre to go to the pub, but Pierre argues that it is raining outside. Georges doesn't believe it matters and it is the way of where they are. He promises to introduce him to Fiona, the waitress with the dragon on her neck. He calls her his sweetheart, but then Shauna tells him she already has children and a job somewhere else. The news disappoints Georges, who becomes sad at the way things are changing. Georges leaves Shauna and Pierre alone. Shauna tells Pierre that Georges is just like his mother. Brief silence passes between the two when Pierre tells Shauna she disappeared from the hospital. Shauna feels guilty for leaving because by the time she came back, Mathilde had already passed. Pierre tells her that maybe Mathilde was waiting for her to leave so she could in order to comfort her. This gesture makes Shauna recognize him because at the hospital he had also given her comfort. Georges forgets his wallet, so he comes back and hits his head. It is the middle of the night, and Pierre is still awake on his PC when he hears Shauna's voice coming from outside. He peers out through the window watching as Shauna stands outside yelling the name August. He is so shocked that he even checks the time. He wonders what is going on. He goes outside to search for her. The wind's current is quite strong. He walks along the beach and finds a seashell. He puts the seashell to his ear when Shauna startles him. Pierre tells her that he heard as she called out and wanted to ask if everything was all right. She tells him that everything is fine. Pierre loses his keys. Shauna tries to help him look for it. Shauna asks him how old his son is. He answers that he is 7 and he also has an 18-year-old daughter. She points out their 11-year difference. Pierre tells her that the reason is because they lost a child in between them. He even tells her the date, and Shauna realizes that it is the reason why he remembers her, since the dates between Mathilde's passing and his son were close. It starts pouring again and they scramble back to the house, with Shauna giggling all the way. They sit by the fireplace. Shauna offers him something to drink. She asks him why he was up and he said it had to do with a client. They discuss that his client was taking an experimental for her breasts, and the discussion doesn't seem to sit well with Shauna. She begins to leave to go to bed, excusing herself, which leaves Pierre confused. Before she fully leaves, she tells him that his behavior is similar to her ex-husband's sexist ones. Shauna stands in front of a mirror. She thinks her aged body doesn't feel sexy. She gives the toothbrush to Pierre, and they both talk awkwardly as they are falling for each other. Pierre and Georges are leaving, and Shauna and Pierre say goodbye very awkwardly. Pierre calls Shauna to update her on the patient he talked about the other day and that it was progressing fine. Shauna is in a locker room with other women, but she lies, saying she is in the lobby of the hotel. Shauna asks him to pay her a visit since he will be visiting Paris soon anyways, but Pierre awkwardly backs out of it. Pierre is back home with his family, and Shauna thanks him for the photos he'd found of her in Mathilde. When his wife asks who was on the phone, he lies and says it's a patient. Pierre calls Shauna after he succeeds in getting his patient's project approved. He tells her he is about to leave Paris when she asks him eagerly if he's only arrived. He tells her he's been around for a while. She tells him she's having dinner, hoping he'd want to join, but he tells her his train is leaving that night. Shauna is disappointed, but Pierre texts her later after his train is cancelled, and they plan to have dinner the same evening. They both run towards their destination. Shauna gets there first, but she's left there waiting till the sun sets fully in the sky despite Pierre's own eagerness to see her. When Pierre arrives, Shauna is glad to see him. He holds her hand since they don't have much time and takes her behind a building where he presses himself closer to her. They glared lovingly into each other's eyes. Shauna tells him that she is about to turn 71, as if to try and deter him, but he only jokes about her inviting him to celebrate. He places his hands on her face and gives her a passionate kiss, but Shauna pulls back, seeing as she hasn't done something like this for a while. Since they don't have much time, Pierre assures her nothing is capable of happening. Shauna's daughter finds her and Shauna introduces Pierre. She lies that he came to get a file from her, and her daughter finds that her mother is behaving strangely. Pierre tries to leave, but they invite him over for dinner. Pierre is introduced to Shauna. They are often swept away by their chemistry and romantic tension, especially when they are close to one another. They have a lovely dinner, even watching her great-grandchild's performance when Pierre places his hand on Shauna's. She pulls away though when her granddaughter notices them. It's time to leave and Pierre catches a cab with Shauna. They arrive at her Parisian house. She tells him it's okay for him to leave if he wants to, but instead he moves closer to her and caresses her with his hands, and they both start kissing. They go to bed together that night and are intimate with each other. At the office, Georges is questioned by Pierre's wife, since he arrived earlier. Later that day he tries to confess to her, but she reveals that she too has cheated and that they shouldn't have to make this a big deal. Shauna opens up slightly to her daughter about finding someone, but she doesn't answer many of her questions about who it is. Meanwhile, Pierre's wife asks him about the woman he is sleeping with, even though she didn't want to know. Pierre tells her it is Shauna and she laughs, but is not happy with the information. Georges is also upset after hearing about it. He and Pierre get into a squabble over it. Pierre arrives to see Shauna. Her hands start shaking after she welcomes him in and is nervously trying to solve a crossword. He sits next to her and she calmly begins to tell him how she does things now that she wouldn't have otherwise done, because she is old and should be incapable of finding love and feeling desired. She becomes flustered, even tossing the flowers she got to impress him like a younger lover would. She asks him what he sees in someone so old and why he would overturn his life for someone she claims has no future. She doesn't believe he can truly love her, but Pierre protests back, telling her that it's too late to turn back now because she shakes him. Shauna is surprised that he feels so much for a woman like her. Pierre, amidst his confession, descends to tears, and she comforts him. He tells her he wants her, and the two kiss and share an intimate evening. He arrives home later that evening. His wife has not yet arrived and he finds his daughter having a smoke. She is about to go when he asks her to have a beer with him. Pierre notices his daughter is upset and asks her what happened. She tells him she has an STI. He was unaware that she had even started dating. She tells him that she thinks she is incapable of love, and when he tries to reassure her, she makes a comment that leads him to believe Jean and his wife had revealed his affair to their daughter. Jean arrives back at the house with roses in her arm and tells the two of them a reason for being late was because she wanted to give someone on the street money and didn't have change. Jean goes around looking for a vase. Pierre looks at her. He's worried. She is unable to find a vase and tosses out some kitchenware and uses the holder as a makeshift vase for the roses. Pierre tries to help her, but she pushes him away. After trying again, he asks his daughter to excuse them, and she excuses herself willingly, but Jean insists on her staying. He doesn't fight back and tells Jean he will go sleep somewhere else. He turns to leave. Jean follows and smacks him repeatedly with the roses, with her daughter having to get in the way as they both plead for her to stop. Their younger son of 11 is woken up by the fighting and watches from above, horrified at the scene. Later that evening, she cuddles up in Pierre's hands as she weeps bitterly. The next day, Pierre walks his son to school. Jean admires the beauty of the unique everyday bodies of the woman around her in her locker room, as if it's one she hadn't really noticed beforehand. Jean packs clothes for Pierre, even though he tries to get her to stop because of the guilt. She begs him to let her do it. She is still a doting wife and even asks him if he has forgotten anything and finds his cell phone he had left behind. Pierre is now living with Georges. The two drink and watch sports. Georges asks Pierre if Shauna likes sports. He doesn't give him an answer, only an awkward smile. This prompts Georges into telling Pierre that he now believes Jean when she said it must be fun to live an adventure with an elderly woman and not care for others. He confesses that he lacks the guts, and Pierre is taken aback by it. Georges tells him that young girls are easy to seduce because of his medical degree, even though he doesn't work in the emergency room. Georges has been taken aback by the situation. Shauna sits waiting for Pierre at a cafe. Time passes, and he has not yet arrived. Disappointed, he gives up hope of him coming and decides to leave. Not long after stepping out, she lights up in awe as she watches him run down hurriedly over the flight of stairs, knowing it's her he's to come see her. Her smile slowly dissipates when he gets caught by the bag of another woman. She watches them as they interact with each other dimly. She isn't sad for long as she lights up again when he picks her up, hugs her and twirls her around like she is 16. Shauna reads a monologue about new love and adventure while she and Pierre take a bath together. He tells her that Mathilde had told him how adventurous and flamboyant she was. He tells her about the time he looked for her at the hospital in order to give her back her photo even though he didn't know why and thinks it might have been immediate love. They attempt to kiss but the bell rings, and Pierre goes out to get it. They share a touching moment before leaving Shauna struggling to her surprise to leave the bath. Pierre accidentally breaks the eggs, and the delivery guy is waiting to be paid. Shauna is still struggling in the bathtub without anyone noticing. She is unable to leave and falls back into the water. Pierre once notices to help her out of the bathtub. They hold on to each other. Shauna tells Pierre that by the time he had noticed her, she had become the old lady he always made her forget she was. Shauna is told by a doctor that her Parkinson's disease has gotten worse. She is being told that if she lives too freely, that she will speed up the loss of control she has over herself. Her age and body are trying to put her back in her place. The doctor tells her that even tying her shoelaces would have become more tasking. Shauna listens to her morbidly as she goes on about how bad the illness is. Shauna is giving a conference when Pierre arrives. She becomes very irritable upon seeing him. He waits for her until she's done. They go out to eat. Shauna is visibly unhappy, but Pierre keeps a positive attitude. He tells her about some new experiments on the Parkinson's disease, but Shauna is uncomfortable with the discussion. Pierre obliviously begins to order while Shauna takes in his beauty and life. This, however, brings her sorrow and not exactly joy. She tells Pierre they need to stop, and he should go back to the station. Pierre asks her what is wrong and if she's tired. He sounds concerned, but she gives him a firm no in order to try and put the point across that this is serious. She tells him as she looks into his eyes, with a sorrowful look on her, that she wants them to stop seeing each other. Pierre asks her why she is saying this. She tells him that she wanted to believe in them, and before she can continue, Sean cuts her off and tells her to stop it. He says to her that everything is going well. She takes her hands out of his. She pivots and begins to tell him that at her age things like this do not matter anymore and that she is bored of him. Pierre finds this unbelievable, asking if he really does bore her. She tells him she is bored of him right now and apologizes for her brash honesty, then leaves. Pierre runs after her when she goes. He tells her they need to talk, but Shauna simply relays to him that she's tired and isn't in the mood. Pierre begins to panic. He tries to reassure Shauna that he understands her and how she feels and that he knows that she is afraid but that he isn't. He asks for her trust, but Shauna coldly dismisses him and tells him she doesn't need him to be concerned about her. He tries to convince her by telling her he loves her, which is why he is there for her. She calls him twisted for having such bad taste and falling for a sick old woman. Pierre tells her he doesn't mean what she is saying about herself, because he can't see someone he loves so much talk so badly about herself. People in love can hardly ever bear that the person they love has given into self-hate. They want you to love you because they love you. He begs her not to screw their love up. He pleads that he needs her to save him. She tells him she was fine before him in his love. She asks him to leave her alone, but he refuses to leave her. She argues that she resents meeting him, but Pierre doesn't believe that it is true. Shauna tells Pierre that he will be her demise. He lets her walk away after that. Shauna arrives home absolutely devastated. She watches as Pierre lingers outside her house. Later it begins to rain as she is sitting in her living area. She peers again at the window. Pierre hasn't moved an inch. He still stands there under the heavy rain waiting for her. Upon seeing this, she comes down and goes to meet him where he is. She is drenched and she tells him she loves him. She says he loves her too, and because of that she is begging that he leaves. After begging him, she turns to go outside. Her daughter runs in on the interaction between them both. By the time Shauna goes back up, he is not there anymore. Her doorbell rings, and she goes to welcome her daughter. In her daughter's arms, she collapses to the floor. Shauna is sitting at her dining table in her home. Her daughter asks her if she will have something to at least drink. Her mother has remained stoic on the table, heartbroken at her preliminary loss of love by her own doing and fears. Her daughter asks her why she didn't tell her it was Pierre she had met and fallen for. She answers that she wanted to protect her, but her daughter berates the idea as she loves her mother so much she would not have been so hurt. She then jokes about Pierre not being her type, which wasn't what Shauna thought of when she thought of hurting her. Shauna bursts into tears. Her daughter comforts her. She spends the night with her and leaves in the morning, promising to give her a call. She leaves her mother's home still processing the situation. Rosalie and Jeannie are at the hospital. Jeannie takes this time to apologize to her daughter for what she and her father are putting her through and everything else, like never really being there for her when she needed it. Her daughter is pleasantly receptive to her gesture and asks her mom to be with her. Pierre invites Cecilia out. When she arrives, she doesn't seem all that pleased from the way she looks at him. Pierre seems oblivious to this. His mind is focused on Shauna's safety. He goes on to tell her about how Shauna would need a bathtub with a door installed to try and make sure incidents like the one they had before don't happen and to increase her quality of life. Cecilia is livid. She echoes to Pierre what Shauna had said. That she was fine until he met her, but would it have been moments she'd take back in exchange for living a few more years at her age, and who she thought she was. She asks him if it was worth it. Pierre doesn't answer and politely asks to be excused. Cecilia immediately regrets her words, apologizing for making this situation harder and making him feel guilty because it was unkind. 3 months go by. Shauna is back in Ireland in her little old house in an unindustrialized area. The scene pans to Shauna sitting outside on a phone call with her daughter about her life. She is back to her old loveless life. It's even worse since she has tasted what real love felt like. Pierre also goes back to work as a shell as well. Shauna is trying to come to terms with her decision. She spends her days alone battling with her emotions. Meanwhile, Pierre is also having a hard time due to the breakup but has respected Shauna's wishes. Shauna's health begins to slip. She calls George's in panic late in the night and asks for Mathilde, who has already died. Shauna starts to panic and George is worried by the phone call but doesn't wake Pierre, who is sleeping right next to him. Shauna is taken to the hospital and her daughter and granddaughter keep her company. She hasn't lost her memory. Pierre is going on in life, separated but co-parenting with his ex-wife. Georges and Cecilia reminisce in front of the hospital. He tries to give Cecilia some comfort. Jean visits Shauna in the hospital out of curiosity of who she is. She tells Shauna that Pierre is doing terribly. Shauna invites her to sit and probes her mind over the affair. Jean tells her that after they lost their child, she was a mess, but Pierre remained strong at the expense of his own grief. She tells him he had still been that strong man until he met her. She tells Shauna, even as it breaks her, that Pierre needs her. Shauna sits on a bench, cane in hand, taking in the serene fields of nature. She watches the people around her live their lives as if once again being curious about the world and its awe. Pierre joins her at a cafe. He gently places his hands on hers, but she removes it just to place it back on his instead. She tells him to move on, but he says he cannot. She begins to give him all the reasons why he has to move on. But the awful thing she will be put through doesn't deter him. Even the fact that she's on her last legs. He brushes it off, telling her that she and him are still breathing the same air like he did when they first met. And he asks if they can enjoy that air while they're still alive. Shauna nods her head and says yes to love again.